horse is showing distress and it is ignored, then it indicates that the younger generation is going to see that same distress and ignore it as well.
One thing that is a very blurred line is to train any person or animal, there's a certain level of discomfort there. So how much of the training should be uncomfortable?
But to the small people around, that looks like if I get somewhere and I make one mistake, I'm done.
So this is about horse riding and intelligence. I really apologize for the way this is going to come across, but it's not a slight or anything like that. So a piece of research basically looks at horse riders and intelligence, and they found that horseback riding for children and for human health to be associated with horses' vibrations, and that riding horses actually helps children to respond to an appropriate action depending on the situation. So this is why I'm a big advocate for horse riding with kids, because actually it teaches kids to use self-control.
Yes.
And it's very good to use that with adults as well. This isn't just applicable to children, it's also applicable to adults, because with horses and horse riding, you have to be controlled. You have to have the ability to limit and control yourself. You can't just be reactionary all the time. But this led me, and this is my personal research, into horse riding and intelligence. And we whipped it down into 3 categories: academic intelligence, body intelligence, and emotional intelligence. And what we actually found, and please don't take this in a rude kind of way, the academic intelligence was actually relatively small, but emotional and body intelligence, so spatial awareness, stabilization, so on and so forth, and the ability to read emotions, the ability to pick up on emotional states of others, were almost off the chart. And this is quite interesting for us because, okay, they may not, as an industry as a whole, we may not be the most intelligent academically wise. We're not full of professors and kind of PhD grads and all of that type of stuff. But as an industry, we are highly, highly, highly emotionally intelligent. So meaning that we can pick up on distress, we can pick up on happiness, we can pick up on all of the emotional states above and beyond. That then leads into the next line of questioning / difficulty, is the choice of seeing it and accepting it, or seeing it and changing it. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the education systems or educational people in higher authority, because if you're seen as an educator in higher authority to see a horse in distress and basically have a ignoring element to it, then that is reciprocated within your student. And we see this in human reaction. So if there is a child and they see an adult, their teacher, see a child react emotionally, and that adult, that teacher, then ignores that child which is emotionally upset, then the children learn to basically mimic that and copy it. So ignore the emotional state. Now, if you have that within the educational system where a position of authority is teaching a student where the horse is showing distress and it is ignored, then it indicates that the younger generation is going to see that same distress and ignore it as well, because it is deemed as collective association. And that is where it becomes difficult, because, as I say, what we have to see is our educational establishments and our educational positions of authority, so our influencers, they very much need to be, for want of a better word or terminology, is to be calling out the emotional distress.
Yeah.
And if they're not doing that and they are just blindly ignoring it, then that basically feeds back into the younger generation. If it's being called out, then the younger generation will take notice and actually see that this is not appropriate, and therefore that facilitates change as well.
But this diagram, this emotional part, is that riders that have been riding for a while?
This was done on riders. So this was a a piece of research which we did.
I actually don't think this is very strange, because
No,
if you think about horses and their beings, you have to learn how to read the horses. And I think that gives lots and lots of information on the orange scale.
absolutely.
So I'm not surprised at all.
What you generally found was the horse riders could spot emotional distress or emotional changes within the horse and human a lot easier. They were generally pretty much 10 out of 10 type scores, 100%, whilst in relationship to the academic qualifications was actually really quite low. So in some regards, it wasn't surprising for us. It's one of those things where you kind of know it within the industry, but nobody's actually done it, if you see what I mean. I know it's so obvious, but you sit there and go, well, let's just double check.
No, but
has it changed, especially as we've got kind of younger generations coming up through? Are they more qualified now academically? But generally speaking, it's not that much of a difference.
So just inquiring here, should we be focusing then on the young riders rather than perhaps addressing the older riders in terms of improving horse welfare? Should we focus our resources on how we train the young riders and what they see in their training?
Do you want my answer on that one, or do you want to go for Annette first?
Let's go for Annette first.
Okay, I think that's a hazard because riders get very old. We ride a long time. So I think just focusing on the young rider, that leaves a large gap.
Okay. But can we do much with the older rider? If this abuse is endemic now, personally, I don't think we can do too much with those riders that don't understand how to change and may never change or change the way they ride. Do we have to put particular focus on the young riders and how they are being trained and what they are seeing? What do you think?
Yes, but again, it's the older riders teaching the younger riders. So you have like a circle there.
Okay.
Going round and round.
Yeah.
But I think competition-wise, I think we need to have clearer rules. For example, if you do a Helgstrand, you need to be out of the business.
Okay.
You shouldn't be allowed to compete anymore. That's just a fact.
Yeah.
It's horrible he's even on a horse again. I think we need to make a difference there.
I would just say that giving like a barefoot trimming example, 25 years ago, there were some very extreme situations going on with barefoot trimming. And if we had not been exposed to that, we would never have so many healthy barefoot horses now. So sometimes these people who perhaps are ambassadors for abuse, they're actually bringing attention to it so that we do deal with it. We can't do anything about those. I personally don't think we can. These people are cooked. They have no idea about their personality defects. But, there is a slightly brighter side to that, where at least they draw attention to what needs to change.
You have that small top that funnels down to the other people that has learned this behavior.
Yeah.
But not necessarily every one of them want to continue do that. But they don't know how to change.
Yes.
I don't think everyone just mows on and on and on in that manner, but a fairly large percentage of them, I think, maybe starts to understand it's not okay.
They have been rewarded, though, for that behavior, either by the horse who submits to it, or the judges who reward them. So they've been through a reward system where they've had so many rewards for training in a certain way that they don't know another way.
No, but then again, it's fairly visible.
Like,
it's fairly visible when they are competing and showing the things they depend on, because the horses doesn't respond like they should They have patterns in the movements that shouldn't be there.
Yes.
Like, they can fold out their front legs because they're used to bungees and stuff. Doesn't look normal.
Yeah.
And it's visible. They use a lot of aids too, because they can't just in every other country but Sweden, I think, you can compete with the whip. That's insane to me. The whip isn't even supposed to be there in competition. We can't have a whip from the easiest classes even.
Okay.
It's you have to leave it outside. And it's this constant spurring and sawing in the mouth, and I think it's very visible. They can't control the horses like they do at home.
Yeah.
So I think it needs to change. The rider and horse should look comfortable together.
Okay.
It should look easy.
Yes.
Maybe when it doesn't look easy and the rider is working overtime, the point shouldn't be there. That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
No, generally, I would full on agree. Going back to your psychopath comment, which I totally agree with, by the way.
Yeah.
But
do I.
you find psychopaths in most high performance industries anyway.
Yeah.
So that in order to be at the top level, you have to be a little bit. You have to have certain personality traits. Is the most polite way of describing it. Because
it's a personality trait.
It is a means to an end. Is the methodology, is the mentality behind it. If you see what I mean, it is okay. The horse is irrelevant. It is a vessel for me to achieve. So there's a huge amount of ego. There's a huge amount of various other components to it. Going back to answer kind of your original question, Caroline, with education and who do you focus on? And you know, Annette is absolutely right. It's a circle. You can't just isolate one half. The difficulty is that if you were to do it as a circle and you were to have the older generation on the top half and the younger generation on the bottom half, the difficulty is that the two intentions are going to be different. The intention at the older generation and the language which you use and the conversations which you have are more orientated necessarily around performance. Okay, I know a way of actually improving the performance of your horse for short term, medium term, and long term, but it means that you're going to have to do a slightly different methodology of training. But you will get better results. So that is the type of language which you would use for the older generation, because you're sat there kind of going, right, because they've got to understand that, you know, they're used to quick fixes. They're used to kind of going, right, use this tool, use this thing, and you will get a result. And you're going, yes, but it's also creating a lot of stress. It's creating a lot of pressure, like adverse pressure, so on and so forth. If you try this method where it's actually going to take slightly longer, and then some people will immediately walk away and go, no, I'm not interested. I'm able to get my results, so I'm going to keep doing it. People want quick fixes. So you've got to work with the personality of the individual. The language which you then use for the younger generation is slightly different, because you're actually looking at more of kind of going, okay, longevity. And this is also because there's various other factors which we have to include with younger generation, which is turning around and going, horses are expensive, right? They're really, really expensive. So actually, if you turn around and go, right, if you train your horse inaccurately, you're highly likely to get injury, which means that you're not going to have a horse. So the language which you use with the younger generation would actually be going, okay, let's do this training methodology and this educational methodology so that you take your time and actually you have a longer career.
Yeah.
Rather than actually going, you know what, let's do all the short-term results and short-term things. And then, hey ho, your horse, which you spent a vast amount of money on at the age of 5, is now broken at the age of 9 or 10. And you suddenly have to use very different language and very different lingo with the two generations. And I'm saying that broadly speaking, because you have a section in the middle, which is very much my demographic, my age bracket, which is kind of the 30 to kind of 45, 50-year-olds, which are, because we were the transitional age bracket. We were educated in the 80s and in the 90s. We had the introduction of the internet. We weren't ruled by the internet. We, all of that type of stuff. So our generation now is kind of picking and choosing. We have some people who are stuck in a methodology of training, but you also have the same age bracket, which are also going, actually, no, let's change the industry. So our bracket in the middle is the transitionary ones. We're the ones which are actually now starting to step into positions of authority and whatnot. So we have the greatest leverage. So actually, you'd almost kind of want this kind of tiered approach with the different age brackets. And that's why I say is you can't just keep it kind of binary. We've got to have this kind of almost staggered approach. And I would argue very much with the older age bracket, you turn around and go, okay, what's the legacy you want to leave? Because if you start using words like legacy, all of a sudden people go, okay, that's going to last beyond me. So when I'm off with the worms and God knows what else, and whatever you believe in, what is my legacy? That older generation, all of a sudden, they're like, okay, yeah, I want to leave a legacy. I want to leave something behind. You don't turn around to a 20-year-old or like Annette's daughter, and you turn around to her like she's 17 competing at Grand Prix, which is amazing. Kind of going, okay, what's the legacy you want to leave? She sat there kind of going, legacy? I'm 17. What kind of pressure are you putting me? So, but you see that to a 55-year-old or a 60-year-old who's kind of nearing the end of their career and actually looking back at it. And you go, okay, what's the legacy you want to leave? So that's where, as I said, the language is very, very different. And how you influence that is quite important as well. And that's where, I would say that the governing bodies, the governance of the industry, they should be approaching it this way. They need to be looking at it and kind of going, okay, what is the legacy we're going to leave for the younger generation, and what are we going to kind of instill going forward? But again, that goes back to how we govern. That comes back to the various other elements within the industry. As I said, keep going back to that little diagram which I did. That's where it becomes quite fascinating. That's where you go and you have to go through this kind of process and understanding it all. And that's why we have to have these conversations. Because they're hard, they're tough, and multifaceted.
Which is why, as you say, the message has to trigger emotion rather than punishing people.
Rather than punishing, or rather than facts. I know it sounds really strong, really odd, and I'm very much a fact-driven person. Trust me, I look at numbers and data, but I also fully appreciate that human beings are not numbers and data. They are to a degree, but if you give numbers, it generally blinds people. Or if you're telling them facts and whatnot, people are emotionally driven. You've got to get people to listen to you and be emotional, and then all of a sudden they're like, actually, these people know what they're talking about, and I disagree with some things, but I agree with their sentiment or anything like that. Okay, I'm going to explore it further. It's a metamorphosis. It's a changing process. I've lectured to older generations, people who are my peers, and talking to them is a very different way of talking to an undergrad student. Typically, an undergrad student is full of the whims of summer and kind of yay, whilst the older peer group are a little bit long in the tooth, and it's like, oh, right, okay.
I think also, if I can just stick something in here in between about punishing and maybe close the door for someone in top sport or something like that. If I can take just an example like Hellstrand, I think it's important to show that we don't accept things in the right way, because I know we can take the recent Charlotte Jardin case too, but for the outside it looks like Andreas Hellstrand can get away with anything, no matter how many things he's done, so horrible things. And then there's a whipping video for a couple of minutes, and that's 1 year suspension. I understand maybe it's necessary, but to the small people around, that looks like if I get somewhere and I make one mistake, I'm done. But if I have lots of influence and lots of money and many partners, I can get away with anything. I don't think that looks good. I think it's bad to whip a horse like Charlotte did. But I also think that for what's come to light, it's very strange to make an example of the lesser thing. It should have been the other person that repeatedly offended everyone, everywhere, that should have been suspended for life. Because I think if you repeatedly make these mistakes and train in this way, it should be allowed. It should be forbidden. Totally.
Maybe we should say if you're found to be repeating, because I don't think abuse is just a one-off in an adult person. I don't, but that's
no, maybe that, but we know we can only judge what we see, and what comes to light. We can just sit and guess, because I can guess my neighbor is a serial killer, but I don't have any proof. He killed a mouse, but is a serial killer. It can get very big, and I'm not really necessarily think it's a good thing to make an example of something that we think is horrible, but I don't think everyone does, and it's a lot of talk about it, and small people feel a little bit scared about, well, what if they whipped a horse once and it's on film or something, and it may not have been a very big thing or anything. But the example is, it's the if you think the proportion of punishment and what comes to light should be maybe a little bit more fair.
I think we are in the middle of a change or flux at the moment. And I think the rules have changed. We've seen some change, so we have to embrace that change. We're a ways off yet, but one thing that is a very blurred line is to train any person or animal. There's a certain level of discomfort there. So how much of the training should be uncomfortable to the animal?
Uncomfortable.
So to me, the quickest fix is a comfortable horse and a comfortable rider. But training can be physically challenging. So you could argue, should we be subjecting animals to that physical conditioning? Yes, if it's done right and the animal's comfortable and there are rewards, there's enjoyment, as it were, fine. But I think there's a body of people who think that animals deserve to be coerced, to be trained horribly, and
I don't understand that
line. It's very blurred.
Yeah. Hopefully many people like horses, that's why they keep contact with the horses.
I'm gonna say something here. As somebody who has trained at Olympic level, and I'm saying sport like rowing, okay, that was my sport, okay. I was a horse rider, but I'm too big, too strong, too heavy to compete in, because I wanted to do show jumping. I don't have I'm heavily dyslexic, so I could never do dressage because I could never remember a dressage test. And that was genuine. I can't remember dressage tests. There's too many things, but I can remember colors, so I could do show jumping. But I was too big, too heavy. So I went off and did rowing. And Caroline, you're absolutely correct that in order to train and to exercise, there is a degree of discomfort which you have to willingly put yourself through. In order to compete at an international level, you have to be willing to physically put yourself through discomfort. With a human, that is an agreement. There is an agreement, a subconscious agreement between kind of you turning up to training and doing it, and your coach.
Maybe not the children, but that's a whole
maybe
other.
not the children, but as a kind of late teenager / kind of young 20s, you have an unwritten or a kind of a subconscious agreement that every time you turn up, you are willing to train and push hard, or whatever the training methodology was. The argument is very much that in horses is that they are used for our interest, our choice, and there is no equestrian decision making process. Which makes it very, very difficult, because you do sit there ethically and go, right, this horse has not necessarily agreed in the typical sense of agreement to train hard or to train in a certain way. The difficulty is that you will never get that answer. It is a horse.
No.
It doesn't speak our language in any way, shape, or form. So to a degree, you have to accept that there is going to be some level of discomfort within the horse. The difficulty is, my argument is, there is a greater emphasis on the rider / trainer to act as a regulator of that, of how much is too much.
Yes.
And that comes down to the individual. Now, some trainers, some riders, they will not be a regulator because they will just want to push, which is commonly where the horses then break, or they have a failure in their skeletal system, or they mentally jack it in, or anything like that. So the difficulty is then you have to put greater emphasis on the education. You have to put greater emphasis on the trainer and the rider as emotional and physical regulators. So you can't have a purist perspective of going, okay, horses, they can't agree to an agreement, therefore you should never train them. It's actually, no, the greater responsibility is then on the rider and the trainer and the industry, arguably, to then put in protocols, boundaries, limitations, so on and so forth. And that is where something like the pain ethogram, I don't agree with the pain ethogram 100%, but I understand it as a tool, and I think it is a fantastic tool for the greater community to start utilizing it as a way of regulating horses' performance and various things like that. But the greater emphasis should be on the rider and the trainer as the regulator rather than the horse, because quite often we use the horse as a regulator. We turn around and kind of go, oh, the horse is blowing, or the horse is tired, or the horse is this. And you go, no, the horse did that 10, 15 minutes ago. It's because you ignored it. And that is where my argument comes from. In regards to what Annette is saying in regards to Helgenstad and Charlotte, you've got to remember is that one is very much a public figure and very, very well known by the wider community in terms of society as general. So I'm talking about Charlotte here. She is an Olympic gold medalist, and she is more well known by the general public. Helgenstad isn't. If you go to anybody in the general public and go, who's Helgenstad? They're going to sit there and go, a Formula One racing driver? Who? So the difficulty is that partly the reasons why Charlotte got the decision making which she received is because of her social structure in general or greater society, rather
but is it
than
fair?
that is a wholly different argument, because then you're looking at the governance, and
in every decision we need to be factual. We can't have the feelings in there.
Right. If you're being truly factual, being devil's advocate, then theoretically quite a lot of the industry shouldn't be involved within the industry. So that's why if you're really looking at the numbers, then you're going to lose a substantial amount of the industry. But the problem is society doesn't work that way. It doesn't work on pure numbers, and it doesn't work. There is that emotional component, and there is that sociological component. So I don't agree. I understand where you're coming from, and I do. I absolutely 100% do. The difficulty is that you have a governing system which has to be seen to doing something, and where it will kind of come down harder on a public figure than somebody who is more in the background but has more numbers, more contacts, more influence, and various things like that. I totally agree with it. I do not like it myself, and they can kind of get away with a little bit more, and that's because there's ambiguity. The general public don't know who this person is. And that's where the difficulty lies. If you want to use cold, hard facts and whatnot, then in which case the governing system has to substantially change, and you have to have like a strike rule. And you would have to have a strike ruling, like a 3-strike rule, basically, for trainers, for riders, and for horses as well. For example, if a horse strikes out and kicks another horse, so you'd have to have a 3-strike rule for a horse. That may be an accident which the horse did it, but the horse reacted that way. Well, that's the problem with the training. That's the problem with the rider. Absolutely. But riders can't be beholden to every situation, if you see what I mean. You know, accidents do happen. And where does that occur? You know, do you have a 3-strike rule per year? Do you have a 3-strike rule for your lifetime? Do you have a 3-strike rule that leads a whole nother protocol or kind of set of governance in and upon itself. They've tried to implement it in racing, for example, where you have the whipping rule, and that has done relatively well. It's kind of certainly curbed it, but the problem is then, like anybody trying to get ahead or trying to perform, and that's where the psychopaths come in, they try and get around the rules. You know, as soon as you start implementing rules, then people go, right, that's the boundary, so I'm going to go around it. That's where people contact me and go, okay, how can we get around this ruling?
Behind the vertical, that is so obvious. You know, they could have a 3-strike rule for that, as in how many strides, and they are onto it. Yeah. But I think we see a pole being knocked down by a show jumper and we all go, 4 faults. But for dressage, you can't do that. It's a black art, certainly the judging of it. But I think we do need clear markers, and behind the vertical is one of them.
But that's also where you would then utilize things like AI.
Yeah. Oh, you've got a slide about that.
I've got a thing on AI, which, you know, is sorry, complete nerd. But that's where the use of things like AI, especially at international level and kind of higher up level, is very, very good. But you will not get rid of it at lower level, because do you see the next conundrum is we're talking about high performance, but you sit there and go, well, you've also then got the trickle down as well. At what point do you start limiting? And if you do that as a 14-year-old where you're not on an international stage, or you're not, you know, do you get away with it? And then do you start creating a almost 2-tier kind of industry, which is personally where I think we're going anyway within the equine industry. I think we're creating a 2-tiered industry between the haves and the have-nots, but there's multiple reasons for that.
I think what we're doing, we're really focusing on the systematic abuse. I mean, we've all stood in the field, you know, with 5 minutes to catch the horse before you catch the train, and the horse just won't be caught or won't be loaded. And, you know, we've all been frustrated by that, and the horse hasn't been harmed whatsoever by that. But it's this systematic, money-driven, ego-driven, I have to win driven that is the problem, and that's what needs to be dealt with. And the FEI can only apply its own rules, and it is going through change. It may be a bit too late. The harm may already have been done. I think that's really interesting that it's going to take it. We need a focus on the younger generation, but it's the older ones of us, me included, who have been perhaps had some rather Dickensian education methods directed at me of when I was younger. And I think technology is possibly going to help us. But anyway, we're striding ahead of your slides. You'll have nothing to talk about soon.
Trust me, that's not going to happen. I've got 100. So one thing which everybody talks about is rhythm in horses, especially in dressage. Now we have a proper name for it, which is called biomechanical syncopation, which is variations in the expected rhythm of movement patterns. Now, why am I bringing this up? So there's reasons why, because especially in dressage, we are always talking about rhythm. You know, what is rhythm? We want rhythm. And I say that with kind of saying it with rhythm. So the problem is that it can either be natural or it can be trained, and it can involve and not be limited to stride variability, reactive adjustment of the rider, expressive motion, gait modification, lead changes, and adaptive responses of the horse. They're all posh words, but basically it means rhythm in a big horse compared to a little horse are going to be very, very different.
Yes.
And the reasons why I say that is because, for example, let's look at stride length, and stride length impacts rhythm. So an 18-hand stride length in walk is roughly 5 to 7 feet. whilst in a 15-hand horse, the stride length in walk is 4 to 5 feet. So all of a sudden, you have a different rise and drop of the horse's back in walk. Which one is right? Now, do you push the 15-hand horse to extend their stride length to catch up with an 18-hand horse? Or do you have an 18-hand horse which you reduce and you bring down to a 15-hand stride length? Now, this is where it's fascinating, because stride length, when we watch dressage, when we kind of observe it, there is a inherent rhythm which we watch and we attune to, which is based on our biomechanical length and anatomy. Okay? So if you are a horse rider who is 4 foot, okay, and I'm using that as an example, okay, you sat on an 18-hand horse, which is in walk doing a 5 to 7 feet stride, is going to be more difficult, okay, because of biomechanical forces and various things like that, than for you to sit on a 15-hand horse. Whilst myself, who is 6 foot plus, is then going to sit on a 18-hand horse, and because of my biomechanical length of leg and so on and so forth, I may find an 18-hand horse more comfortable, whilst a 15-hand horse a little bit too short and jarring. So this is what we're talking about in terms of rhythm. And this is basically knocking rhythm down into its basic, most core components. So when we look at horses competing in dressage, we look at the number of strides of the horse going down the long side. Now, a 15-hand horse over 4 to 5 feet kind of stride length is going to do an extra 3 strides compared to an 18-hand horse, which has a 5 to 7 feet. Now, which one has the right rhythm? And it's not as simple as that, because that's also dependent on the rider and what they can sit to and whether they push it forward or hold it back. So this is where, when we're starting to look, and this is pulling up something which is quite obvious, is it's all subjective. The riding judge is going to look at a horse and they are going to judge it subjectively. Their personal opinion, their personal influence. If you see a big rider on a small horse, you would expect them to do big strides because you'd be expecting them to push them forward. But that may push the horse out of its own inherent natural rhythm, which then means that the horse looks rushed.
Yeah.
And they then get marked down. But yet they're trying to compete against an 18-hand horse, which has a natural 7 feet. And I'm just talking about walk. We're not talking about trot. We're not talking about canter or anything like that. Yeah. So all of a sudden, who's at the disadvantage? The smaller horse. That means then it forces the industry to then breed bigger and bigger and bigger horses and bigger striding horses, because we are getting trained to seeing horses with bigger strides to sit into rhythm. Do you see the scenario? We're now in a situation where the industry is kind of like the lion and the gazelle situation. You know, you have this kind of perpetual process of evolution. In order for horses to get better results, they have to do bigger strides and bigger rhythm, greater rhythm, more impetus. Well, in order to do that, you've got to breed them bigger. And because you breed them bigger, and then the next one kind of has an exceptionally long walk or exceptionally long trot or anything like that, you get increased potential for biomechanical wear, but also that bigger horse movement then becomes normalized within the judge line and the judges, and they start saying, oh, this is amazing. And it then gets kind of almost propaganda kind of settles in within the industry, because all of a sudden the video of this large moving horse, which has just won a gold or a silver or anything like that, is then perpetuated around on social media. And that becomes almost, that's normal. That is the A grade. So you've then, the next generation have to beat it. They have to do bigger. Do you see this kind of almost lion and gazelle scenario, which we've inadvertently created, which is why now you're getting horses which are so overdeveloped in their leg length that they can't actually, when they're developing, they can't actually bend their necks down to eat the grass. They have to then stand separated legs. They can't stand together and just bend the head, because biomechanically we have morphed horses into this kind of perverse kind of striding animal.
Yeah.
But if the emphasis was on harmony, then size wouldn't matter
Doesn't, in the
so
most
much.
polite way possible, and this is especially coming from a man, size doesn't matter. But it is that if
So
you remove
it's what they're emphasizing as the thing to judge. Very interesting.
And this is why when we talk about rhythm, and this is why I've had to put this in, because we talk about rhythm quite a lot in dressage. Has it got a good rhythm? Every rhythm is different, but we are attributing rhythm as a very generic set of boundaries subconsciously. Okay, because of judging and results and various things like that. And the problem is we are not judging rhythm on the individual horse.
Yeah.
The rhythm of a 15-hand horse is going to be slightly different, the rise and the fall, because of their stride length. And it's just pure physics. But the rhythm of the 18-hand horse is going to be, again, very different because of physics.
I think that's a little bit picking it apart, because viewing horses, it can have a big movement in itself. It can look very nice and beautiful with a rhythmic big gait in a small horse too. It doesn't necessarily have to be big.
Not necessarily has to be big, no.
No, but we see.
But what gets you the results?
Yeah.
I'm talking about it in context of competition.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about it in context of kind of the purity of the horse and the purity of movement. I'm talking about it in order to get results. You know, you're in a competition, you want to win.
Yeah.
It kind of.
I think there's lots more small horses now in the highest classes.
Yeah, there are.
And we've had a mule this year, haven't we? Doing rather well.
But look at the stride length of those smaller horses.
It's changing a bit.
Yeah.
So we have to change the benchmark. I think that's what needs to change, and it will take a while. But yeah, I see it as giving space for the ethical riders to come through, for the ones who are training good movement, not theatrical movement. Yeah. And we are seeing that. Becky Moody, for example,
you're starting to see it.
The poster girl of healthy horse movement and management. So we just need more Beckys to be coming through.
Absolutely.
And to move the cheese and reduce the rewards for those who are more theatrical, shall we say.
Harmony must have a more pronounced place in competition.
So this is where basically dressage in the early development of the discipline was fairly harmonious. Unfortunately, in the 90s and 2000s is where we started to get a clear separation between competition dressage and what is now deemed as classical dressage. In the 90s where it all started to separate, and it separated for a multitude of reasons. So we're going to go through that. But also the separation happened at different times within different countries and cultures. Okay, so a lot of this is based on the UK, because that's where I'm from, and that's where a lot of the reflection and research has been done. And that's because culturally, there are a couple of things which happened within the UK which allowed for that process to occur. Culturally, horses are trained differently in different countries, which saw the separation between competition dressage and classical dressage happen at slightly different times. So we've got to bear that in mind as well. But the reasons why I say that is because of the rise of the middle class. Now, I know that sounds a bit of a laugh, but in the 80s and 90s, basically the middle class really changed their financial situation. And what happened at the same time in the UK specifically, there was a drop within the agricultural industry within the UK. We started to basically manufacture a lot of products outside of the UK. So all of a sudden, a lot of farmland and farmers, small farmers, basically sold up and moved away. So that meant that suddenly there were a lot of small farms coming up for sale, which could then have change of use and turn into equestrian yards or personal properties. That meant that subsequently you had a lot of people who had suddenly seen their financial situation rise. They bought a property with land. They're able to keep the horses no longer at a yard, but now at home. And they want an arena in their backyard in order to speed up training, because all of a sudden they think, if I have an arena in my backyard, I can do more training. I can get better quicker. That then led to a subsequent change in training methodology, because when you used to train, it was much more hacking work, endurance-based work. It was long, it was slow. And then all of a sudden, having an arena in your back garden meant that you could suddenly change the training methodology to a short, sharp, intensive training, which is also tied in with the corresponding rise in stifle injuries, hock injuries, tendon injuries, so on and so forth. The also thing is that because you had the rise of the middle class, you also meant that people could have more horses, and because they could have more horses and they could train more intensively, and hacking reduced, you could actually ride more horses within a day. If you actually think about it, when you used to go out for a hack, it used to be 2 hours, possibly longer, that you'd just be poodling along in walk and trot and the odd canter here and there. That's 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours as a whole spectrum of time for one horse. And then all of a sudden you go, right, I've got an arena in my back garden. Actually, I can now train 2 or 3 horses within that time frame. So we've changed our training methodology to try and squeeze more in. And you certainly see this in the 90s and 2000s, when the rise of arenas really started to come into fruition, where everybody started to put an arena in their backyard or back garden or various things like that to just try and get more training in. So what you saw was a change in profile, is that people did less hacking. And that was also because in the 80s and 90s, there was more introduction of cars on the roads, especially within the UK. So people felt it was dangerous to go out hacking because people were driving cars dangerously, too fast around horses. They weren't educated enough to slow down around horses. So people were then kind of removing their horses from hacking to do more training in the arena because it was safer. And there is a logic behind it, and you can't argue with the logic. Doesn't mean it was right, but it was the logic at the time. Now, as I say, this is all based on the UK now, and that's because we're an island, and we very much kind of have limited size and volume and resources. When you compare this to other countries like Germany, for example, and I think France as well, that actually those cultures very much held on to a yard culture rather than the individual having their horse at home. It took a lot longer for German individuals to have their own property with land, to have horses at their home. It's still very much culturally odd to do that. If you keep your horse at a professional's yard and you go to the professional's yard to train the horse to ride, unlike the UK where we like to keep everything in-house. I have land, I keep horse on my own land. I am protecting my horse, my land. Whilst in Germany, for example, you have your horse stationed at your professional's yard. So there is a cultural divergence here going on as well, which had an impact on training methodologies, which is also the reasons why you see training methodologies are very different in the UK compared to Europe, France, Germany, Sweden, for example. Arguably, you're much more patient in Europe than we are in the UK. The UK is not very patient. All okay? Yeah. So that was just a diagram just to basically show how it kind of deviated kind of in the 90s and early 2000s. And the reasons why I'll get onto in a minute. Again, just throwing this diagram up again, just so that we kind of have a bit of an idea of what we're going to go into next, which is solutions.
I feel like I have a horse trying to do everything before I want her to do it because she cries so much. Okay, I can't imagine a horse not liking it.
I said I wasn't going to get involved. I am going to get involved. Yeah. I totally get where both parties are coming from. The thing which is, in my mind, separating is dressage is more orientated in regards to philosophy. It is more orientated towards an idea of philosophy, i.e. harmony of movement, beauty of expression, synchronicity between horse and rider.
Yeah.
Every other aspect within the equestrian industry does not have a philosophical component to it. And I mean that in the most purest way.
Yeah.
Show jumping, to a degree, has a philosophy of, if you want to delve deeper. But the basic brunt of show jumping is get over the fence. And the basic brunt of racing is get to the post first to win loads of money. The one thing which isolates dressage from almost any other discipline within the equestrian industry is the philosophy which it is born under. And every other discipline does not really have a philosophical basis. Dressage does. And the difficulty is because it has a philosophical foundation, and dressage has a philosophical foundation, that creates disharmony, because what one person interprets as a philosophical foundation and somebody else will interpret slightly different, because it's philosophy. It is not objective. And that's where, in my mind, the difficulty within dressage occurs, and why there is such a myriad of different interpretations of dressage is because not that it is a problem in and upon itself, but actually rather that because it is born from a philosophical foundation. So that's where I'm sticking my line, because everything else is relatively objectified. Which makes dressage so difficult to judge, and so difficult to perform, and so difficult to train. If you actually think about the methodologies of training for, say, racing or jumping like that, because it's a quantifiable kind of parameter, get from A to B as quickly as possible. Right, so that's quantifiable. There's no that you can add philosophy to it, but it's getting from A to B is not based on any kind of philosophical ideology. Dressage is, which is why it's so difficult, and why you get this kind of, I'm going to say it in a slightly horrible way, but a perversion of, and that's why you had the separation in the 90s and early 2000s between competition dressage and classical dressage. Because you had almost the faction groups separating, going, I can't do this, or, you're not getting the results anymore, so I'm moving away. I'm not saying one is better than the other or anything like that. I have my opinions, and I think it's made blatantly obvious my opinions on certain things. But that's why dressage is so difficult to, and it's difficult to have these conversations. It's difficult to kind of come up with a result. It's difficult to kind of figure out what's right, what's wrong. And that's why we need these conversations, and we need to have this kind of toing and froing of a myriad of different things. But as I say, my observation is that dressage is purely based on, or the foundation of dressage is based on philosophy.
I just feel like it's very interesting, like me and Caroline, how differently we perceive it from our own experiences.
Perhaps I didn't express myself very well. To me, dressage is a feeling. It's a feeling you get from the horse that moves well, and that you flow with the horse. The performances that I'm seeing at the top levels, the abusive performances, the unhealthy movement, that doesn't look fluent. It doesn't look like the rider's getting a good feel. They're fighting, they're sitting on the back of the saddles, and they're it looks like a war between them, and
that really need to change. I don't understand why you can
It's got to
Just being
change.
back, like almost lying back on the
Yeah. And these riders, I feel like they're missing out on the magic that they could have with their highly bred horses. So yeah, that's why it has to change, because I think those riders are missing a trick there. They're missing an amazing experience, or the experiences that they used to have, perhaps, as they progressed, that maybe they're not getting them with at the top levels, except for the few good examples.
Yeah.
And those few good examples, that comes from managing them well, managing them ethically, not just riding them ethically.
Do we want to carry on?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, can I ask you, because we've been going nearly 3 hours, how many more slides? Because we can divide this into two. We
There's
can always
loads. There's loads.
Well, shall we break?
I haven't even started yet.
We've covered a lot.
You
I
do
think-
realize that if you leave me with this for longer, I'm going to start adding to this, because my brain just doesn't slow down. This is the problem. The thing is that there is so much to this, and it's not a
Yes, it
simplistic kind of A is the problem, B is the solution,
Yeah.
C is how you execute it. It's not that. It's
extremely complex.
It's
Oh, God,
complex.
yeah.
Isn't it? So we've had an absolutely fascinating discussion. I did say it could have gone anywhere really, and it did. So I can see a box set coming here. I'm confident that now that we're talking about solutions throughout the industry, I think it will get better for the sport horse overall. Huge, massive thanks to Annette and Bradley. Thank you very much. Good
No problem.
night.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.